We're going to try something new here with video lectures. I've got my Word document pulled up and I'm going to type some things as I talk about them. What I'm trying to do here is to have us think through digital communication technologies in a different way. When we think about communication, the communication process, we think about this interaction between the speaker and the receiver, right? So you have the speaker and the speaker says something or creates something with symbols. There's some type of symbolic exchange that goes on. I mean, we call these messages, whether we're speaking and using auditory words or we're using nonverbal body language. When we're writing, we're using written words. When we're drawing or when we're taking videos and we use pictures and things like that. I mean, all of these are symbols. And these symbols have meaning associated with them. And we exchange these symbols to try to understand one another. And these messages can be exchanged through a medium. A medium is basically anything that conveys the message, that essentially helps to communicate or transfer the message from one to another. Air by itself is a medium when we're face to face with someone. Light, in a sense, is a medium, especially if we're trying to look at someone and interpret the weird body actions that they're doing or just any body language they're doing. And we have had a long history of what we call analog media. And those are the more physical media, is another way we think about them, where there was no computer involved in the creation of the technology to allow us to communicate with one another. And we'll talk about a lot of these older technologies too, because we can go all the way back to cave paintings. That's a technology. The idea of taking something that isn't us, that is not our body, and using it to communicate with another person, that's technology. That's a communication technology. So you have cave paintings to, paper, up to even more advanced technologies like photography and telephone. None of these at the beginning had computers associated with them, but they were all serving the purpose of communicating and allowing us to be able to communicate. And what they did, and we'll get into this when we get into each one of these main areas, is that they allowed for communication that did not just occur with the people who were near to you. Because when it's just, speaking and body language, there's a pretty big limitation. There's that constraint of only the people around you can hear and see you. But when you start putting things to paper or to photographs and to, radio signals, then it affords you a lot more. You can do a lot more with it because suddenly you can send messages out to a wide range. I mean, we've got radio signals right now produced here on Earth that are out past our solar system. That's amazing, given that in the past we could only make gestures and the people around us could see it. And along with being able to reach people further means we can reach them further, not just in space, but in time. Because now we can suddenly start to record things and to have things last. We would not know about cave paintings if they did not last for thousands and thousands of years. This starts to really change human civilization. Not only can we communicate across vast gulfs of distance, but also of time. And then we can start reaching more people when we get into something like the printing press. All of this starts to change humanity. And we'll talk about these different technologies, these analog technologies, for how they allowed us to engage in different communication modes. Because again, there are certain ways that we can create symbols to get our messages out. There's the auditory, which is at its basic speaking. There's visual, looking at something. There is, though, written and moving images and interactive, immersive. There's all these different ways that we've been able to create in order to communicate with one another. Because of how fundamental communication is to civilization. Without communication, we wouldn't really have civilization. And I'd even go further. I don't think we'd have humans the way that we do. We know from anthropology that there were a lot of other hominids out at the time of Homo sapiens. There's at least 4, probably more, that were all existing on this planet at the same time. But I bet there was something about our capacity to use technology for communication purposes that really put us above. Because then we could start to organize, whether it's tribal hunting, agricultural, more complex forms. I think it made a difference. But okay, I digress. Throughout the course, we're going to talk about these different modes and how we've gone from an analog approach to doing that communication. How, like with audio, we've gone from speaking to phonographs to podcasts, for example. Because what we're going to do is we're going to look at the analog and then the transition to the digital to understand how we have been impacted. We're going to do that for each of these different types of sections throughout the semester. Starting, of course, with this idea of what is digitization or digitalization, which is basically just when computers come in. Computers take over to an extent, and they become so integral to a lot of aspects of our lives. The goal is to try to understand, of course, how all of these technologies, how all of these new media have impacted us, our societies, our cultures. I guess I should put our communities in here too. Because they have. And the reason why I don't call this class new media is because we've always had new media. Now, new media was often used in the past to be the descriptor, to explain the digital communication technologies, to say, oh, well, we've had, television and film and whatnot. These new internet thing and World Wide Web and, cell phones, that's new media. Well, yeah, that was maybe new media when I, a 42-year-old, was growing up. But now it's just media. But I do think we still want to make that distinction between the physical and the digital. I think that's still an important distinction to make. So we are going to think about that. And we're going to think about how we've changed, how we've adjusted, how we use these technologies. We're doing so from a media ecology perspective, which basically says, everything is connected. If you've ever taken ecology in your biology classes, it's that same idea. Everything is connected. To understand how the media has impacted us, we have to understand the media industries, the media regulation, and the media users. Because it's not just technological determinism, which basically says media impacts us. This is the argument, where people have said, oh, television will rot the brain, or video games cause violence, or, social media causes addiction, and so on and so forth. It's that idea of the technology determines us. Because there's also sociocultural, throwing the big words out at you now, sociocultural determinism, which basically says we impact the media. And we'll go through some examples of these. Telephone is a good example because initially people were thinking about using telephone for broadcasting purposes. How we use the technology can impact what the technology becomes. All of that is to say, we're looking at these digital communication technologies for how they have come about, how they have impacted us, and how we have impacted them. And in doing so, we're going to consider three main forms of communication. There's interpersonal, which is essentially you engaging kind of one-on-one with someone, maybe within a small group. Interpersonal communication is one of the larger areas in communication studies where we try to understand what happens in romantic relationships, friendship relationships, work relationships, when you're talking one-on-one or communicating in some way one-on-one. Indeed, your media richness activity in the discussion board for this week kind of gets at that, because you're looking at ways of communicating with a small number of people for a particular purpose. And yeah, there may be some technologies that are better suited for certain types of interpersonal communication than other types of technologies. But basically, any of the technologies we talk about could be used for an interpersonal communication purpose. So we're going to interrogate that and look into that. We're also going to look at mass communication. For a century, for basically the beginning, or since the beginning of communication as a field of study, we've divided communication between interpersonal and mass. And mass communication was essentially concerned with the broadcasting communications, or the mass distribution of communication from a one source, or maybe a concentrated source. So it's kind of going from the one to the many. That's what mass communication is. And so things like radio and television and film and print, newspapers, that's been largely more concerned with mass communication, looking at how the one can communicate to the mass. And then, of course, how the mass can communicate back to the one. Political communication, health communication, these are fields where this is really important. And some of the technologies may seem better suited than other technologies. But again, what we're going to do with each of these sections is to try to understand the potential for mass communication with all of them. And this last one is probably a trickier one, because as we go through this semester, we're going to talk about interpersonal media, where we primarily think of like telephones as an example. We're going to talk about mass media, where we think of television as an example. And we're going to talk about social media. And this is the tricky one, because social media has basically come to be used to refer to social networking sites. So we think of things like YouTube and Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, so on and so forth. But I'm going to make the argument, and we're going to have this discussion throughout the semester, that social media should be considered more broadly than that. Because I would argue a lot of things can be social media. Social communication, to me, and again, I'm going to love your input on this because I think this is something we can really dig into. Social communication is when you have the masses talking to the masses. And really, one way to think about this is this idea of power. And power in a socio-cultural sense, not like an electrical sense, or I can't spell that, electrical sense or anything, but socio-cultural power is this idea of the haves versus the have-nots. Or, the elites versus the non-elites. Oops. Or the wealthy versus the poor. I mean, those are all kind of far too simplistic ways of thinking about it. But it is that idea of, certain people in a society or culture have power and others have less power. And traditionally in interpersonal communication, let me try to see if I can, I can't spell it again. Where did it go? Interpersonal communication has involved, kind of equal power. At least more so than others. More so than mass. Because with interpersonal communication, you can have situations where it's like, it's just you and your friend. You have equal power within a situation. And yeah, you can have it where you have, a manager talking to an employee, and there may not be equal power there. But the employee has the ability to still talk back if they really want to. There's usually more equal power amongst the participants in interpersonal communication, especially compared to mass communication, where you have unequal power. Because you have, traditionally, only certain people could make films and television and radio. They had to have money. They had to have capital, the resources to invest in this production and distribution. And it was costly. Not a lot of people could do it. So you had certain people who did. But with social communication, we're seeing a different idea, because then it's kind of like it's equal power again, where, let's see, how do I want to put this? Anyone can become powerful, if that makes sense. Maybe instead of saying equal power, we'll put it this way, where anyone can become powerful. And it's that idea of, something going viral. Someone who has the ability through their social networking sites to become an influencer. Anyone can start to make a change through these social media. And that's kind of what I want us to wrestle with. Because we like to think that these technologies that we call social media today, these online technologies, have never happened before, and we've never really had that ability to have social communication before. But that's wrong, and I want us to recognize that. And overall, I do this because I want us to recognize ourselves not just as users or consumers of these technologies, but as producers, creators, designers with these technologies. It's moving from being without power to being empowered. That's kind of my goal for the entire course. So hopefully this makes sense. I'm hoping too that as we work together in this course, it'll make more sense. But I look forward to the conversations that this will generate, and I hope this provides a basic overview of my approach to the course.